I think oftentimes people look at Bitcoin as a solution in search of a problem, and
Yeah.
that the reality of the situation is that people do not understand the problem that they have. They might know that they have problems, but they might not know the root cause of it or the source of it. And that, in my view, the most pressing problem that everyone is suffering is that their money is constantly being debased, and that Bitcoin is the solution to that problem,
Yep.
and that they're seeking out somewhere on the range of imperfect solutions to bad solutions
Yep.
for the problem because they misunderstand it.
Okay.
And that Bitcoin solves the most important problem for the greatest number of people on earth, and it's still very early and not well understood. And that once they figure out Bitcoin, and they can also most efficiently go down that rabbit hole because it might be complicated, it might be unintuitive at first, but it's a finite surface area. And all of the other derivative problems that they might perceive in their life stem from, in most circumstances, maybe not all circumstances, but in most circumstances, at least from a financial perspective, because their money is constantly losing value. And so all the time and energy they're putting into to accumulate money or to acquire money to pay for various things in their life
Right.
is being destroyed, and Bitcoin fixes that.
The biggest problem in the world it fixes. And so when you solve a big problem for a lot of people, there's a lot of value created. Let's just push on that for a second because what you're saying is it solves the biggest problem for the most people, which is their money is losing value. So they have to work harder and harder to maintain their life. But do you think most people, when we talk broadly, the masses, understand that? Like, do they see that as a problem?
They they see it as a problem, but they don't understand the
Yeah.
extent of it. I'd say most people are engineered to know that their money loses value, so they try to address it on the margin. They invest in the equity markets to offset inflation, or
Right.
they invest in real estate passively to offset the problem. And one of the things I like to say is like, hey, if there's a business that needs to be funded that is going to deliver a lot of value in the world, those businesses still need to be funded. If you dig up dirt and build a piece of real estate that delivers value, like that is a necessary
Yeah.
piece of the equation, because ultimately money is helping to facilitate exchange and to deliver real goods and services to the world, which is really what
Yeah.
improves people's lives. But in the circumstance where people know that their money loses value, but not knowing why, or that it ends a lot worse than they think, that it's not just their money losing 2% a year, 3% or
Yeah.
5%, that ultimately it stops working. And there's plenty of historical evidence,
Yeah.
and there's also a fundamental underpinning it that humans can't work
Yeah.
and convert their time and energy into something that can be easily produced,
Yeah.
money being created out of thin air. That it's that they know there's a problem, they just don't know the root of it or the extent of it, or
Yeah.
how negatively asymmetric the the end consequence of money being debased really
Yeah.
is.
I would just go a step further. I think most people see prices going up and things keep getting more expensive. And so if I don't invest, how will I buy them in the future? Which is the same thing as you're saying, but it's the opposite side, right? The money is being debased, it's losing value, which is why prices are going up. But they don't see the money being debased and going down. They just see the prices going up.
Yeah, Saif Moose, the author of the Bitcoin Standard, has a great quote that I consistently see circulating, where he's saying the groceries aren't getting more expensive, your money's losing its value.
Right.
And it's the other side of the same coin, but it's a really important framing to shift your perspective
Yeah.
and your understanding of the root problem.
Right. And we saw in the last election that we just had where Trump won, and inflation was probably one of the hottest subjects going. But people aren't really understanding the root cause of this inflation, or as they see CPI going up. And so, yeah, so not understanding the problem at hand, that's the number one obstacle to Bitcoin. They think of it as a solution looking for a problem because they don't realize the problem is that the reason why your life keeps getting more expensive is that your money is losing value.
Or connecting it to Bitcoin, that Bitcoin's the solution to that.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Got it. So, you know, you used to write a lot. You've still been writing some stuff. I want to talk about some of the stuff you've written, but the big one is the gradually then suddenly, which is amazing. And you sort of took like a first principles approach to sort of explaining Bitcoin. how would you put that into maybe like a 3-step framework for people to like think about and then maybe go dig into and research more from there?
Yeah, so the three things are the problem that Bitcoin's actually solving, that is not a solution in search of a problem, that it's an express solution to an express problem, and the problem is printing of money. So
Start there.
start there. You have a problem. One of the things that you just mentioned is in the last election, at least in the United States, inflation was a big uh, focus area. I never saw one politician who was talking about it on the stump, connecting it to the printing of money.
Right.
The printing of money is the source of that. You have a problem. The printing of money is the problem. Bitcoin is money that can't be printed. It's the solution for that problem, and it's expressly built to solve it.
Right.
So connecting it to the problem is one framework. The second framework is understanding Bitcoin from a bottom-up perspective as to why it actually solves the problem and how. And the quick high level of that is that its fixed supply is the source of all fundamental value in Bitcoin. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin.
Right.
What it represents is money that can't be printed, and that how Bitcoin is able to enforce its fixed supply is of significant consequence to the equation. That it is not random, it's not by happenstance, it might be complicated or complex. There's a lot underneath the hood, but you first have to understand why it's relevant, why a form of money that can't be printed would be relevant to somebody, to then
Right.
be able to go down and connect the dots as to how the economic incentives are able to be held together such that Bitcoin can credibly enforce its fixed supply
Right.
without the need for trust. So that's the second thing. And then the third framework is all of the common misconceptions about Bitcoin,
Okay.
which are that it's too volatile to be money, or that it can be easily copied, or that it's just for criminals, which just for criminals is becoming less of a knock on Bitcoin as governments around the world and corporations around the world are adopting it as money. It's becoming more difficult for somebody to posit that, but basically understanding things that are difficult to see. If you could say, hey, it would make sense that if there were a form of money that can't be printed, that everyone would adopt it.
Yeah.
But how does that marry with the fact that Bitcoin goes up 10% in a day or down? That's not how I have known, or, I say I, but the person that's evaluating it might look and say, well, Bitcoin can't be money for that reason.
Right.
And in reality, if you realize that it's volatile for the reason that it has a fixed supply and that everyone's adopting Bitcoin for the first time, it's naturally volatile. It's necessarily volatile. So
Right.
people have to work through those mental blocks in order to come back to the highest level ideas behind Bitcoin,
Yeah.
to see how they're consistent with each other and not inconsistent. So the problem, the fundamentals, the bottom up, and then the common questions that are logical to ask but have coherent, consistent explanations.
So let's dig into the volatility and why it can't be money. So obviously, with you work on Bitcoin payments, that's sort of your life right now with ZapRight. So I want to dig into that. I want to talk about stable coins and the Genius Act and maybe how that complements or doesn't complement Bitcoin. But let's just talk about the payments piece overall, and we'll talk about those things. So the volatility is there. The price of Bitcoin going up and down. I think that's a good thing. But in regards to like being a stable medium exchange today, maybe it's not. So there's today and there's a future. So like, will it ever be versus is it the best today? So how do we think through that? Because if I'm in a country with a failing currency and I could maybe go to the dollar, I could go to Bitcoin, but I don't have that much money. And if I go to buy groceries next week, but I can't buy as much, that could be a problem. So how do we think about the volatility, as you said, in regards to payments today versus like an evolution of that?
Great question. So, one, I think that to start, you have to understand why Bitcoin's volatile. You have to understand why it's volatile and why volatility is not a risk. And when I say that, it's that volatility can be a risk depending on what your time horizon is.
Right.
And so you have to be able to explain to yourself first why Bitcoin would store value over time despite being volatile, that its volatility is actually to your benefit. That, one way I would think about it is if only 1% of the world has any material exposure to Bitcoin, and if you marry that with this idea that everyone in the world, if they understood that there were a form of money that can't be printed, and that Bitcoin is that, and that its fixed supply of 21 million is credible, that 99% of the world is yet to adopt it.